Good morning, Australia. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. It's a little bit awkward to be all the way here in Canada the evening before talking to you. We've got many people working very diligently to bring me to you, and I want to extend my appreciation very much to Lisa and Barry on the other end for helping us work out this, I don't know, it's kind of miraculous that I don't have to fly all the way there to be with you today. So thank you very much for hosting me and for entertaining this talk. It's a real privilege to be able to be with you today, even from afar. And I hope what I've prepared for you is something that's a little bit provocative and will stimulate some great discussion for us. I have been informed that we will take questions at the very end via email because of the time delay from when I talk to you here. At least it makes it very awkward for answering questions directly. So if questions occur throughout the talk, I think you have a way to relay them over to somebody so they can be emailed to me and we can take those at the end. And I look forward to a very interesting and vigorous discussion, even if it does take place by email. So the talk I have prepared for you today is really a call for reflection and action. And I've been involved in wildland fire research for the last 15 years. And during that time, I've had the opportunity to work on many large wildfires, work with many incident commanders, decision makers, and communities, all with the same goals in mind, which are really to improve wildfire policy in some form or fashion. And I believe the time has come to ask ourselves whether or not we've been effective. And I believe we can be more effective. And I think that's what I really want us to think about today is how is it that we can be more effective and what can we do to be more effective? So I think it's a time to take a really hard look in the mirror for us. Prior to 2000, wildfire research had really focused predominantly on biophysical science and the biophysical aspects of fire. But beginning in 1998 and into 2000, the Joint Fire Science Program, and so this is in the United States, as well as the National Fire Plan, began funding social science research. I'm a social science researcher, and so that's about the time when I began receiving funding to look into questions of wildfire. And so 15 years later, something that began to occur to me is, well, how effective have I been in terms of the work that I've been doing? And I think these are things that we should be asking ourselves. Have we been effective? And if we have been effective, how would we know it? How would we know that we have been effective? And so I think what this suggests to us is, do we have a problem? Would we know it if we did have a problem? I think we do have a problem, and I want to diagnose it for you today, and that's what I'm really going to focus a large portion of my talk on. I'm also going to present a vision for moving forward to address the problem, and as my title suggests, this has something to do with looking at wildfire as a socio-ecological problem. And while I want to be clear, I am being critical in my talk today about some of the things that we've done. I in no way want to impugn the incredibly good work that many people do, both in research and on the ground as fire managers, in terms of the many things that they've done to improve wildfire policy. These are incredibly complicated and complex problems, something my colleague Matt Carroll talks about as a wicked problem. But all the same, it's really important for us to reflect on how we have worked so far so that we can be more effective into the future. And wildfire culture is such that there's a really great tradition of after-action review and sort of questioning and looking at what we've done. And so I think that's exactly what I propose that we do in this talk. All right. So while I am ostensibly talking about the United States, I'm American, even though I'm coming to you from Canada. Much of my research has taken place in the United States. And so while much of the US context is specific to, much of the context I'll be addressing is specific to the US, I think some of the lessons are transferable to Australia, but I'll let you all be the judge of that. And that can perhaps be a place that stimulates some discussion about some of the similarities and differences. I think it's relevant to Australia, and I think some of these lessons are also relevant to my new home country, Canada. So I want to begin really by laying out what the current goals are here in the United States by taking a look at policy from 1995 through 2014 in the United States. So over the last 20 years, these have been the predominant policies to try to drive what we do in the United States. So I thought that was a good place to start in terms of reflection. And we start in 1995 because in 1994 was the year of Storm King Mountain, the year of the South Canyon wildfire where 14 wildland firefighters died. And that caused an awful lot of reflection in that particular year about what was working or what really wasn't working in terms of what was happening to our wildland firefighters. So that began some very serious reflection that I would add continues to this day, because it was only in 2013 that we had the tragedy of the Granite Mountain hotshots, 19 hotshot crew members who lost their lives in a fire in Arizona. So in many ways, we haven't really come that far from 1994, which again is one of the reasons why I think we do need to reflect a little bit in terms of where we are. So what you have in front of you now is really a thematic analysis of a whole variety of key themes that pop up across all of those policies over the last 20 years. And I'm going to advance through the next few slides quickly. Sort of several themes will pop up here until we get to sort of 5 key themes up there. And what aggregates out of the review of those policies over the last 20 years is 5 key themes. Respond appropriately to wildfire up on the right-hand side. Down on the bottom right-hand side, restore fire-adapted ecosystems. On the left-hand side, build fire-adapted communities, reduce hazardous fuels, and then there in the center, agency coordination and community cooperation. So what that thematic analysis suggests is that we have 5 broad goals laid out in our various national policies, and the key question is, how are we doing to achieve these goals, right? So are we moving closer to them? Are we moving further away from them? And I'm going to present you some data to suggest how we are doing, at least so far. And data, as always, are imperfect, but it's the best we could do. I think it at least helps provides an empirical basis for the continued discussion. So the first goal I want to focus on is to restore fire-adapted ecosystems. And what you'll notice about these 2 key indicators, the number of acres moving towards the desired class condition and the number of acres moving towards maintained in desired class conditions, are both sloping downwards, an undesirable direction in terms of how we build restore more fire-adapted ecosystems. The second indicator we have are total prescribed acres across all agencies here in the United States. And as you can see, it's trending upwards slightly. I think that in an ideal world, we would like to see a lot more prescribed fire on the landscape. And so while this is a positive direction, I think that ideally we would actually like to see it moving upwards a little bit at a little bit steep slope. The next slide, build fire-adapted communities, our second goal. What we're looking at is the percentage of acres treated in the wildland-urban interface. So this is the percentage of acres treated in the wildland-urban interface, which is the area where forests and communities meet in what's called a Community Wildfire Preparedness Plan, a CWPP. So these are community-identified priorities, and that is trending upwards, which is a positive indicator. The number of stewardship contracts and agreements is trending up over time. So stewardship contracts are ways to engage in removing timber or other material off the land that is non-merchantable. So in other words, they can engage in ecosystem services to take off small diameter timber, create fuel breaks, take off materials for biofuels and other sorts of things. And so those kinds of contracts serve both the community and the forest to create something that's more fire adapted. And those are trending upwards at a very nice rate over time. Next slide. In terms of building fire adapted communities, what you'll note, at least here in the United States, is that the number of structures lost over time continues to trend upward. It's highly cyclical, at least in terms of what it looks like, but it does seem to be headed in the wrong direction. Our third goal, respond appropriately to wildfire. This is a peek at firefighting fatalities over time, and what you'll note is that over time they are trending upwards, and you'll notice those peaks in 1994 when we had Storm King Mountain, and again in 2013 when we had the Granite Mountain hotshots. So again, a direction, we would certainly hope this would be trending downwards, not upwards in 2015. The next slide looks at the percentage of fires not contained on initial attack that exceeds something we call the Stratified Cost Index. So the Stratified Cost Index is an estimate of what it should cost per acre to put out a fire. And what we're seeing is that estimates are increasing over time in terms of exceeding the Stratified Cost Index, a direction that is not desirable. Next slide looks at total fires by year over a 30-year period, 1985 to 2013 nearly. And as part of that, what you'll see is that total fires are decreasing slightly over time. And I'm going to move into the next slide, which is looking at total acres burned over the last 30 years. So this is all under the category of responding appropriately to wildfire. So what we're seeing is that total acres burned over time is increasing while the number of fires is actually decreasing. So we're seeing much larger acreages on fewer fires. And the question is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Because ideally we would like to see more fire on the landscape, but the problem is we need the right kind of fire on the landscape. So if a fire burns too hotly or too intensely or too severely, it's not good for the soils, it's not good for the vegetation, it's not good for the seed bank, it's not good for other sorts of things. So it really depends on how that burns. And so it's a bit of an open question about whether or not these are trending in the right direction or not. Next slide, in terms of responding appropriately to wildfire, is looking at appropriations to wildfire accounts. That's moving up over time. We see a slight increase in 2008 and 2009 in the United States. That was the period during which we encountered the recession. There was a large investment of government funds at that time into a variety of public programs, and so that's what accounts for that blip. If you move that out, it flattens out just a little bit. Next slide, we're moving on to the fourth goal, reduce hazardous fuels. So as you can see, hazardous fuels reduction appropriations are increasing over time, which is trending in the right direction. We see that blip again in 2008 and 2009. And then the next slide, we also see that acres treated in the wildland-urban interface related to hazardous fuel reduction are also increasing over time, and that's encouraging. All right, moving into our very last goal, cooperation and coordination. In the United States, we have a federated system. So we have the national government, and then we have our 50 states. And so under some programs, what we see is that supports to the states in terms of state fire assistance is increasing over time, but support for voluntary fire assistance is stable, if not increasing just a little bit over time. So what we're seeing is a transfer to the states is increasing over time. Next slide. The last slide that I'll cover in terms of data is something called an FMAG, or a Fire Management Assistance Grant. So if you are a state, municipality, or a locality, and you have a large wildfire that occurs in your jurisdiction, you can apply through the state to the federal government to get 50% of the costs that you incur covered by the federal government. And what you'll note here is that those grants are increasing over time, which I think indicates that more costs are being passed on to the states, municipalities, and localities given the size of fires that we're seeing. So, what does all of this mean? Next slide. It indicates that we've got some mixed to poor results, I think, when we look at all of these wildfire policy goals together. So I want to talk this through a little bit. I think we're losing ground in the landscape restoration battle, especially when you consider that the system is dynamic. So it's not static. So every year we add to that denominator of the total number of acres that need to be treated. And so if we don't even keep pace in one year, we're just losing the battle over time. We are doing a much better job of treating acres in the wildland-urban interface with stewardship contracts. With hazardous fuel reduction, we're doing a much better job of working in the wildland-urban interface. And so that's increasing over time. But again, we're not really keeping pace with the scale of restoration needed to make a larger impact. So I think that's the good news. The bad news is that we're losing more structures. More costs are being passed on the states and local governments, even though the federal government subsidizes them. We see more structures being burned. We're losing more lives. And there are some other indicators in there you can see with the happy faces and the smiley faces and the not so happy faces, where we could potentially be doing much better work. So I think that's really the question. Should we be making better progress after the last 20 years in terms of these major goals that we've laid out for ourselves? And are we framing the problem correctly? Next slide, because in many ways it seems like we're chasing ourselves. We continue to assert that these are the things we want to do. We're doing many things. We are spending a lot of money doing this. In the United States, certainly this year, we will have spent $4 billion, that's 4 with a B, billion dollars on suppression easily. We might have our record year this year. And so the question is, what are we getting for that expenditure? And are we thinking about this in the right way? Is throwing more money at the problem really what's going to solve it? So next slide. So what I would like to propose is a goal, a different kind of goal that we might all collectively think about in the wildfire community. How do we create a socially and ecologically resilient wildfire regime? So I think we need to think about the problem and the goal a little bit differently. And so that's what I'll spend some more time talking about now. So I am going to propose a 5-point action plan that basically can help transform the way we think about wildfire, including a research agenda for social science related to wildfire, and how we should be thinking about training, educating, and helping our next generation of fire researchers and practitioners. Because unless we start focusing on that next generation, I don't see how we can get ourselves out of the current problem. And so the key elements are to embrace a socio-ecological systems-oriented framing of the problem, as my title of my talk suggests, identify key leverage points in the system, develop, maintain, and shepherd collaborative social processes, create new strategies and solutions, and adapt those strategies iteratively. So I'd like to go through all of that sort of in a piece by piece. Now that I've presented the problem, sort of how do we begin thinking about what the solution to this is? All right. So the next slide is, as my title suggests, we need to think about wildfire as a socio-ecological problem. When we think about just one side or the other, we really miss key elements of what we need to be considering in terms of this particular problem. So we need to think about the ecological variables, we need to think about the social conditions and variables, and we need to think about the institutions and the people that mediate between the social and the ecological variables. And if we did that, we would think much, much more explicitly about temporal and spatial scales that inform that kind of thinking. And so that would also suggest some very key questions we should be asking ourselves. For instance, how effective are our wildfire policies in managing the wildfire socio-ecological systems in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, wherever you may be? And to what extent do the spatial and temporal scales in our policies fit the socio-ecological dynamics that are actually driving the system? Do we have goodness of fit between the things that are driving the system and the policies, the institutions that we have that are actually trying to address the challenges in our system? So I want to begin to unpack this complexity, the social and ecological complexity, by talking about the ecological subsystem. So as the figure in front of you suggests, this is part of a 3-piece interlocking subsystem: exogenous conditions, slow variables, and fast variables, and how they all kind of come together. And so the ecological subsystem is driven by these 3 sets. Those exogenous conditions are something that take place on a very long temporal scale and over a very large global scale, spatial scale. So these are things like global climate change patterns. The slower variables over there to the left-hand side would be regional in scope and cover decades, for instance, temporally. The fast variables have a much smaller spatial footprint and occur on a yearly or a seasonal time frame. So let's walk through what this means a little bit in terms of the social subsystem as well. So the social subsystem also operates similarly in terms of temporal and spatial scales, those exogenous conditions, those slow variables, and those fast variables. All right, so I'm going to put these two things together in a very busy diagram, and don't be overwhelmed by it because I've really just taken those first two pictures and put them together with those exogenous controls sort of mirroring each other, the ecological on one side and the social on the other side. And in the middle, you see that's where the human actors are. That's us. And we work through various institutions that really need to be bringing these two pieces together. And currently, we don't do a very good job of this. And if we begin to understand the problem in this kind of a conceptual way, we really begin to frame the problem very, very differently, or understands our problems very, very differently. So I'm going to walk through this a little bit, looking at some of the exogenous controls and try to make a little bit of a case for why this is important to us. So if we think about ecological exogenous conditions, for instance, climate change is the major driver in the system, and it likely will not change in the short or medium term, given all the greenhouse gas loading we currently have in our atmosphere. And carbon dioxide levels are, predicted to increase in the near future, at least as far as we can tell. Next slide indicates that global mean temperatures are highly correlated with increases in carbon dioxide, and those are also anticipated to increase in the near to immediate future as well. And because temperature is highly correlated with global fire activity, we anticipate seeing increases in global fire activity because of those driving forces. So climate change models suggest that more severe fire seasons will be experienced in the Northern Hemisphere, including Canada, the Mediterranean Basin, and the United States. I'm not exactly sure about Australia. I would love to hear some commentary on that if somebody would like to send in a question or a comment about that. Because globally, I don't follow all the trends, but I'd like to know a little bit more about Australia. And globally, we're seeing increases in what we call mega fire activity, or fires that are over 100,000 hectares large. And we're seeing that in many, many different places. So next slide. So that gives you a sense of what might be driving those exogenous conditions. Let's now go to the slow variables. So if we think about a more regional focus, we see similar trends in the western United States. So temperatures annually are increasing in the western part of the United States. The next slide indicates sort of what some of these slow variables are related to this. So why do we see increases in fire in the western part of the United States? Well, it's driven a lot by something we call snow melt hydrology. We get a lot of snow falling in the mountains, but if we don't get so much snow in the mountains, or the snow melts sooner than we would like, that means that forests are basically drier longer, and if they're drier longer, there's greater chance that they could be experiencing a fire. So they become much more susceptible to fire over time. And so that's basically the regional process. So the next slide basically shows how those exogenous controls influence those slower conditions, which then impact those fast variables, the ones that we tend to pay attention to a little bit more. So if climate change is driving those regional patterns, we know that carbon dioxide is correlated with higher temperatures, which leads to changes in wildfire behavior. That leads to landscape level changes. We see snow melt, we have drier forests, we have more wildfire. So that's how all those cascades work from those different spatial and temporal scales. All right, let's turn to the social subsystem and talk that through just a little bit now. All right, so what we have happening on the exogenous side here is an absence of what I would call an effective global climate change regime. The Kyoto Protocol, for the most part, has not been effective in terms of reducing the intensities of carbon dioxide. And so what we see also is that China and India are really driving those carbon dioxide emissions from coal-fired power plants, which is the predominant form of energy production in those countries and will continue to be into the near future. And so there's a lot of skepticism about how we can move forward given those intransigencies in international climate change policy. We have a lot of constitutive government practices in the United States that also make me a bit skeptical about how things can move forward. So we have a culture of private property rights, very strong private property rights. We have a federal system of governance that leads to great fragmentation between the federal government, states, municipalities, and localities. And we have a very long historical legacy of suppression in the United States, suppressing all of our wildfires that is proven very, very difficult to alter or to change. And so I'm going to skip that slide because that's actually no longer relevant. I meant to take that one out. So let's now think a little bit about these slower social variables. All right, so we have housing starts in the United States. So population in the wildland-urban interface is incredibly important in terms of these slow variables. And over time, what we've seen is an increased number of people living in the wildland-urban interface. Now, as you'll notice there, in 2008, we started to see a great big slump in the U.S. housing starts, and that was due to the recession. And over time, that started to climb back up. And so that's a good indicator because as those housing starts climb back up again, a lot of that building proportionally is actually taking place in the wildland-urban interface in the United States. So as long as we have building taking place in the wildland-urban interface, we're going to continue to have big problems in terms of those fast variables that we're talking about. We also have an insurance industry that's been reluctant to take action, and the values at risk, and I'll move forward in the next slide, are increasing. So if we have more building in the wildland-urban interface, we have more structures that will end up being lost to wildfire in the wildland-urban interface. And so in the U.S., you see Texas, Oklahoma, California, the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Washington State, Montana, that are those big hotspots for having lost a lot of houses. You also see down in and around Florida where you have a great density but a different kind of wildfire regime that takes place, just to give you a sense of context. All right, so total suppression costs have also, we've talked about this a little bit, have increased over time. And so as long as we are focusing on suppression and suppression only, it's going to be very, very difficult to deal with the preparedness side or the mitigation side. All right, so in summary, on that social side, we see poor options for mitigation in the climate change regime. We see constitutive level constraints in terms of how we can actually take action. We have a big tendency to focus on the immediacy of wildfire, and media and political attention really ends up, and I'll switch the slide here, really gets concentrated in this lower right-hand quadrant. So that's where all of the attention tends to get focused, and that's really where a lot of the previous slides that I showed when I was presenting that empirical evidence concentrated. So all of the attention is there, but the problem is, and this will be the next slide, what's really driving the system is that upper left quadrant in the ecological properties. So we've got a big mismatch in terms of where policy attention is focused on the fast variables down at the bottom, but what's driving the system are the ecological properties in the upper left-hand side of the quadrant. All right. The next slide, what we need to be focused on the social side are these two upper quadrants on the exogenous and the slow side. But like I said, what we end up doing is really end up focusing on those fast variables down on the right-hand side. So this takes us back to our key questions that I posed a little bit earlier. How effective are our wildfire policies in managing the wildfire socio-ecological system? And what I would say is it's mixed to poor. And to what extent do the spatial and temporal scales of fire policies fit the socio-ecological dynamics that drive the system? And I would say we've got a terrible mismatch in terms of what we're focusing on and what's really driving that system. And I think what's important is that you can't really appreciate this if you don't think about this as a socio-ecological system. So I would like to return to the goal now of a socially and ecologically resilient wildfire regime. And the questions we should be asking ourselves, are we resilient, and at what scales are we resilient? What policies, actions, and research can help us get there to be more resilient? So I want to revisit the 5 key elements. I hope I've made a bit of a case for why we should embrace socio-ecological systems in terms of framing the problem that we currently face. And I think that I want to talk now a little bit about these other sorts of things. Identify the key leverage points, the collaborative processes, the new strategies and solutions, and how we adapt iteratively. All right, so let's turn to the key leverage points, that number 2 thing. So if we are going to have a little bit more effective action, we have to focus on the key leverage points in the system. That means focusing on those most critical cross-scale dynamics. And that means many actions need to be taking place at this exogenous level. And what that means practically is that we probably need to be recommitting to climate change policy. Next slide, we also need to be focusing on that next scale down, those slow variables, again, those most critical cross-scale dynamics, and that includes actions to affect the slow variables that I've just highlighted there. And those exogenous and slow variables are really the driver in the system, and unless we begin to address those, we're not going to have any chance of affecting anything lower in those lower spatial and temporal scales. All right, so next slide. If we don't take action in those at those cross-scale, we need to take action at those cross scales, and the way we can do that is through that number 3 point, through collaborative processes. Working at appropriate scales gives us those leverage points, and we need strategies at the national, state, and local levels to be collaborative and multi-party processes to be effective, because that's where the context appropriate level lies. And that allows us to incorporate appropriate levels of knowledge and create adaptive processes at those local levels, or the local, regional, or national level as appropriate. But we need the collaborative process. So I want to return and sort of talk about what collaborative processes might mean at these different levels with these different kinds of interventions. And the first one is to recommit to climate change policy. So what does that actually mean? What does that mean in more concrete policy terms? It means we need to engage more fully in the Kyoto Protocol, and I know that's a very politically sensitive issue here in the United States because we have a culture that really does not want to accept that climate change is a problem. I know that also persists a little bit in Australia, and I'd like to hear some thoughts that you all have on that and how we deal with that collectively as a fire community. It also means we could reduce carbon intensity in electricity generation, invest more in renewables and alternative fuels, which at least in the United States context would mean accelerate permitting on public lands, including Department of Defense lands and federally subsidized housing, because that's where we have leverage in the United States to make change, expand and modernize the electrical grid, increase fuel economy standards, and promote forests as carbon sinks. Those are all ways that we could really be thinking about climate change. And I think it's a bit counterintuitive when we all work in fire management to think maybe we need to be thinking also about these changes in climate change in order to actually affect our bottom line in the short, medium, and long term. Another place for intervention is to redefine our landscapes. So what does that actually mean? New strategies, at least in the United States, to work on landscapes would entail the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. So that is a landscape level program that allows treatment across large swaths of land and jurisdictions. It's been fairly effective, but it's still in early days for us. Integrated resource restoration is a budgetary tool that allows you to think much more holistically about how you treat a landscape. So instead of having a single budget line for wildlife or a single budget line for timber or a single budget line for your watershed, it integrates it all in one package to think holistically about integrated resource restoration. And then finally, big box burns. This may be more relevant probably for Northern Australia than in other places. But in the United States, what we're trying to do now is to think about how we can burn, when we have an active wildfire, much larger acreages, because that is an opportunity to get more fire on the landscape, and can we work across larger landscapes more effectively. It takes a lot of work with local communities, but it's one area where we do have a tool at our disposal to think about a landscape level change. Next slide. The next point of intervention, reprioritize funds to states and localities. What that's suggesting in more concrete terms is that we're already seeing a shift, and I don't know if this is true in Australia or not, but it'd be really interesting to hear from you on that front. We're seeing a shift, I think, of resources. If not resources, then we're certainly seeing responsibility shifted to states and localities. And what I would recommend is that we need to take 10% of that suppression budget, maybe 10% of that $4 billion, and just devote it to preparedness activities at the local level in the form of large competitive block grants to the states, or and that could take the form of 5-year plans for building socially and ecologically resilient communities. Because I think unless you get people thinking at the local or state level about what it means to be socially or ecologically resilient in their context, it's not very meaningful. And if you had resources to put people to work on that, I think it could really generate some very creative thinking. And so it could take the form of formula-based funding based on risk prioritization. That would be a big undertaking, with key performance incentives. And if people hit their performance incentives, maybe they get renewed for the next 5 years, something like that. All right, and the final area for intervention is to reimagine the wildland-urban interface, that place where communities and forests meet. What does that mean more concretely? Well, it means to reimagine the wildland-urban interface, we need to discourage new building, retrofit old housing to be more defensible. One of the things they're doing in California is instituting a $150 per house wildland urban interface service fee, and that helps fund preparedness activities across the rest of the state. They're also using something called a fire hazard severity map. That can guide insurers, lenders, investors, and even homeowners to make better, smart choices. And then finally, I think there's a lot more work that state insurance commissions can do. And I don't know if you have a parallel structure in Australia, but you must have something equivalent. That could create more differential pricing in the wildland-urban interface, and create something called a wildfire zone, so that at least the price you pay for your insurance premium reflects the risk that you're taking by living in that wildland-urban interface. All right, and then the final point, I had 5 points in my 5-point strategy. The final point is to adapt strategies iteratively. So what does that mean? We live in really interesting times, and I cannot tell you the number of times I've been out on a fire and listened to an incident commander tell me, this is the first, we're experiencing wildfire behavior that we have never experienced before. It was across the press this last year, and I know I've heard it when I've been on fires myself. And so it means we're living in what I call a non-analogous past. The lessons we've learned previously no longer apply to what we can think about or do in the present or into the future. So that really rocks our world when we start to think about how do we prepare for living in this future where we can't rely on past experience. So what that means in some ways is that we've approached the limits to modeling and forecasting. We can't necessarily predict and prescribe. What we need to be doing is engaging in multiple scenario planning, embracing uncertainty, and thinking about heterogeneity as a coping mechanism. We need to think about anticipatory tools, foresight, future-oriented work, engagement, and integration to help us do those things. And importantly, we need to think about what are those future trigger points that once we cross, we know a threshold has been met and we need to engage in different behavior. So that's a little bit more abstract than I probably would like, but at least gives you an idea of what I'm thinking about when I say that. So in summary, at least about these 5 key elements, and I promise you I'm getting close to the end here. I think I've covered all 5 of those elements. And I think the last thing I want you to think about is, with the next slide, is what is the skill set? It's not enough just to put those things up there. The question is, what skill sets do we need to achieve those 5 things? So I'm an educator. I'm in education. I've devoted my life to education. How do we train that next generation of people to engage in this kind of forward thinking so that we can have a more socio-ecologically resilient wildfire regime? So what that suggests is that we need to engage in systems thinking. So it's this idea of socio-ecological systems, complexity. We need to engage in normative thinking. That's really confronting the very tough values trade-offs that will face us over time, because when we have certain values at risk, say homes, and we have other values at risk, say endangered species, how do we think about those kinds of trade-offs in our community? How do we engage in those ethical discussions about what is most important to us? We need to think about building interpersonal competency, And again, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I will tell you that we are seeing an erosion of civility in the United States that creates an incredibly corrosive atmosphere for having the most basic political discussion. And by political discussion, I mean the shaping and sharing of collective values that allow us to advance as people. And unless we cultivate those competencies among our students and among our colleagues, we learn that ability to have those very tough discussions. Strategic competency suggests we can't just think about it and have theory. We have to know how it works on the ground very pragmatically. How do we take it all the way through from concept all the way down to practice? And then finally, these anticipatory competencies that I talked about before. How do we learn to think about the future so that we can anticipate what is coming? Because we are very much conditioned as humans to think about the past, but not about the future and how to anticipate it. So, this also suggests a research agenda, understand socio-ecological systems, understand these values trade-offs, understand collaborative social processes, learn how to evaluate strategies or solutions, and build these anticipatory toolkits. All right, so returning to the final goal, how do we create a more socially and ecologically resilient wildfire regime? I've tried to give you some ideas that I've been thinking about for quite some time. I hope it's been provocative. I hope it's been interesting. I hope we have some really great questions. I want to thank you for indulging me for the last 40 minutes and listening to me. I wish I could have been there in person, and I would very much like to entertain your questions. So thank you very much.
We have some questions.
Okay, great. We have questions. Yay!
Okay, so the first one is, low to medium fire intensity works better for the environment, but are those burns effective in reducing the impact of bushfire?
So I can't speak to bushfire because I don't understand wildfire in the Australian context. But I do know that in chaparral, which I think is a little bit similar in the United States, predominantly in California, you're absolutely right. We need different fire regimes for different types of fire ecology. So, you know, chaparral burns pretty hot and pretty intense, and that's what it's meant to do. And so I think we have to pay attention of getting the right kind of fire on the right kind of landscape and really avoid the idea that there is a one-size-fits-all for different kinds of fire regimes. And I apologize if I gave that impression.
Next question is, part of the problem a paternalistic approach, and the quote they give is, "I'm from the government, I will look after you."
I think that's very much part of the problem. And so the question is, how do we create a shared sense of responsibility? Clearly the government has to play a role here, right? In many ways, the conditions we experience on the ground today, whether you're in Canada, the United States, or Australia, is a consequence of government policies over many, many years. But that does not mean you don't have a responsibility as someone who lives in a risky area for taking responsibility and doing something. So I really like to talk about the shared sense of responsibility. And where do we find that balance? And so, you know, at least in the United States, and this year is a really great example, it was a terrible fire year. We were at PL, priority level 5, for a huge part of the summer, which meant every resource in the United States was allocated, and we were certainly calling on your resources to come and help us in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. We had lots of people coming from our neighbors all over the world to help us fight fire. And so, you know, it creates that shared sense of responsibility. How do we take care of each other and make sure that every individual is doing their part? Because if the resources aren't there, we can't allocate them. And you have to start looking after yourself. So do you know when you should evacuate? Do you know how to evacuate? Do you know what you're taking when you evacuate? Do you know where you're going to go if you have to evacuate? Do you know what those trigger points are? And do you have a communication system set up? Have you done many things to fireproof and to create a fire-safe environment around your own house or in your neighborhood? So lots of things that communities can be doing to become fire-safe and fire-adapted.
Okay. In Victoria, a large amount of our bushfire risk is in the urban-bush interface where people move for the environment, but they are at a huge risk from bushfire. How effective has the U.S. been at empowering local communities to understand and participate in protecting themselves from bushfire risk?
Really great question. Mixed. There's been mixed success, and I think there's been more failure than probably success. So I know that we have some communities that I would hold up as sort of the poster child of where it's actually been very, very effective. So some of those places: Boulder, Colorado, Scottsdale, Prescott, Arizona, Flagstaff, Arizona. With 3 case studies that I've done in past research that really have indicated those are people that understand what it means to live in the wildland-urban interface and have done an awful lot of work to create more fire-adapted communities. Now, I could point to many other communities. California had a very terrible fire season this year. I think they lost more structures this year than they have in quite some time. So, there's plenty of examples of people who live in, those would be, again, at least in Southern California, there's chaparral ecosystems, very high intensity burning sort of and very fast moving fire where it has not been nearly as effective. So I think there's mixed success, and that what we need to do, and you probably have this also in Victoria, which is you have examples of neighborhoods that are doing a really great job, and you have examples of neighborhoods that are not doing a really great job. And I think the more we can do to shine the light on those communities that are doing a great job and hold them up and give them something to be proud about and hold them out there to give other people to emulate, the better it is for everybody. Because I think that peer-to-peer learning is probably better than anything we can do from a top-down way.
You suggested a partial diversion of the $4 billion suppression funding to preparedness. What would a preparedness research program look like to ensure an evidence-based preparedness emphasis?
Good question. So I think what I'm suggesting there is that's money that just needs to be actually diverted not for research but for action to states and to localities. And what I would suggest would happen there is that the states and localities, so if you were in, I don't know, if Melbourne and you had sort of a suburban, or maybe it would be a Melbourne-wide plan, for instance, would come up with how do we create a social and ecologically resilient Melbourne? And what would that begin to look like? And could you put in for a 5-year grant that would give you, I don't know, $100 million? Wouldn't that be great? And you could think about, okay, here's the fuels reduction work that we would want to do. Here is the community education and outreach work that we would want to do. And here is the, here's how we would begin to actually change our suppression culture in terms of when and how we would respond to wildfire. So there might just be 3 big action points. And you would put together a 5-year plan with, I would hope, clear outcomes and indicators. This is where we would like to be in year 2, this is where we'd like to be in year 4, and by year 5 we will have achieved X, Y, and Z. And that grant would then be renewable based on your actually achieving those outcomes, those measurable outcomes in terms of what it would mean to be socially and ecologically resilient in your community. Now, of course, I think there would be some important monitoring and evaluation that would be part of that to see if you are getting there. So maybe there's a researchy piece to that, but the way I was thinking about it was really how do we put money in the hands of localities and states so that they can learn to be more adaptive in their local contexts.
Okay. Is risk mapping impacting house values, and how might we deal with that to achieve the right outcomes?
Good question. We're seeing some of that happen in California right now. I'm not aware of it happening other places in the United States, but I have not done a comprehensive analysis. And at least what it's indicating, risk mapping is having a bigger impact with insurers. And that's where we're starting to see the insurance market change a little bit, is in California. So I think that risk mapping is giving a new tool to insurers to think a little bit more about how they want to treat wildfire as a risk when it comes to homeowner policies. The thing that insurance agencies, insurers face is that fire, when you compare it to many of the other natural hazards against which they insure, is just a very tiny portion. Hail damage in the United States is off the charts for something that they care about, where wildfire, for instance, is something that's actually much smaller proportionally to something they care about. So it's through the creation of some of these tools that I think we need to work to put the tools in the hands of the insurers so they can be more responsive with something like risk mapping.
Okay. How are you addressing values trade-offs in the US and Canada? How effective is it, and how could it be done better?
Oh, very good question also. So we have a couple of tools in the United States, and I'm not familiar enough with the Canadian context to answer that yet. And so one of the tools we use in the United States is something called a Community Wildfire Preparedness Plan. So that's something that's prepared at the community level, where you would get key stakeholders together and they discuss. So key stakeholders would include emergency management, first responders, fire management, folks who care about ecological values, so usually environmental groups. Who else? Folks that would be responsible for evacuation and road closures. So they get together and they try to craft a plan that prioritizes, at least at the community level, where they want to see action and where they don't want to see action. So it's an articulation of those value prospects at a community level, and if an incident management team has to come in and manage a large wildfire in that area, then they have something that was thought about ahead of time that gives them indication about where and when and how they might protect values at risk. So, for instance, if you've got ecologically sensitive lands, those have been identified ahead of time by the community to say, we want to protect this. This is one of our top priorities. Or if you're a tribal authority, which certainly happens in the United States, they know where those sacred lands, cultural sites are. Or if you are living in a wildland urban interface with structures, there's been a chance to do some fire reducing hazardous fuels, creating fuel breaks around those structures so that you've given that incident management team some additional tools to work with if fire starts to moving there. They've got a fuel break to work with, for instance. So that's at least one tool I think that they have to work with.
Okay. What role does the public or the community have in shaping how we move towards a more resilient socio-ecological system?
A lot. So I think this is where we need to move the dialogue out to the more local level and have that conversation. Just like those community wildfire preparedness plans, that gets the community thinking at least about what can and should be done at the local level before the fire hits. And so I think localities and communities have a big responsibility. I think that's part of the thrust behind why I suggest we need to move more monies to the states and localities. Because right now, we live in such a schizophrenic society. We say, get ready, prepare, make sure you're ready to deal with everything before the fire comes. And then once the fire comes, we have incident management teams that say, I'm the government, I'm here to help. Just evacuate, right? How do we create a more seamless system of responsibility and shared accountability throughout the whole, system of preparedness, response, and recovery? How do we think more seamlessly about that whole process so that we can get people taking responsibility from the beginning, when you need to be doing all the preparedness work, to when we have responders on site so that you're actually being responsible there as well as to recovery?
Okay, that's all the questions I have.
Good, because I was getting tired. Okay, so I want to thank you all very much for your time and for the honor of being able to speak to you from afar. I hope the technology worked really well. And if anybody has any follow-up, I don't know if you have my contact information, but maybe Lisa or Barry can get that to you, and I would love to hear from you. I just only wish I could have been there in person. So goodbye.